Joseph Schumpeter believed in creative destruction, but he also believed in intuition. Intuition is what entrepreneurs need when they start a business, when they scale it, and mostly when they find themselves in difficult waters. With this series of lectures that started in 2016 and saw many great minds share their thoughts with us, we went to help guiding the entrepreneurial intuition. We are bringing excellence in research together with excellence in entrepreneurial ventures. I would like to thank the Hungarian Presidency of the Council, with whom we co-organized this event, for offering such a great venue for this evening. May I now ask you, State Secretary, for your welcoming words on behalf of the Presidency, please.
Thank you very much. Good evening, welcome to Budapest. I have a short 200 pages presentation for you. We have enough time for it. Good evening, esteemed delegates, honored guests and passionate advocates for SMEs from across Europe. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Budapest for the 2024 European SME Assembly on behalf of the Hungarian Presidency. First, let me extend a heartfelt thank you to the European Commission for organizing this event, together with us, and warmly welcome the Deputy Director Generals. A special welcome to the SME Envoys, who play a crucial role in championing the interests of Europe's small and medium-sized enterprises. It's particularly meaningful to gather here in Budapest, as it was during the first Hungarian presidency of the EU 13 years ago that the SME Envoy network was established. We come together here again to bridge challenges and spark growth for European SMEs. Last year, the SME Assembly was a great success under the Spanish presidency. I hope that in a few days or within a few hours, this event will receive a similarly positive response and feedback from you. This year's Assembly is inspired by a powerful motto: SMEs shaping Europe's future. These words remind us that SMEs are not only our economic foundation, but also the drivers of transformative ideas, local employment, and regional development. Allow me to make a personal comment as well. I took my office this autumn after 20 years as a senior banking executive, spending more than 22 years in different commercial banks. As State Secretary for SME Development, I was given the mandate to foster a direct link with business leaders and representations. Over the past few months, I have met personally with more than 50 SME clients so far, making it a priority to visit at least 5 companies a week. These face-to-face meetings have given me a first-hand view of the struggles that define the SME sector today. Entrepreneurs have shared with me stories of resilience, creativity, and ambition, but also the very real challenges they face: administrative burdens, limited access to finance, and the pressure of slowing industry. All of you in this room are aware of current EU challenges: fluctuating markets, complex regulatory frameworks, supply chain disruptions. Moreover, as Europe seeks to maintain its competitiveness on the global stage, small businesses face the same issues. They don't always have the resources or time to invest in the infrastructure, the research, the talent needed to propel them forward in the modern economy, so we, who are responsible for enterprises and for the development, need to step up and provide support. As we consider the unique challenges faced by Europe's SMEs, it's important to recognize that mid-cap companies, who are just slightly larger than the traditional SMEs, often share many of the same struggles, particularly in the face of intense global competitions. Europe's SMEs and mid-cap companies operate in a vastly different context from their counterparts in other parts of the world, where company size and economic scale often say and play out on the entire different level. Offering them a tailored approach would empower them to innovate and compete effectively, leveling the playing field and strengthening Europe's position in global markets. We look forward to learning about the new SME segmentation definition and the associated set conditions. They say Hungarians' creativity knows no bounds. There is a joke that perfectly captures this. If you step into a revolving door with a Hungarian, don't be surprised if they somehow manage to step out before you. And this is exactly the spirit we look for in the field of the SMEs today. Always one step ahead, finding new angles, solutions, and ways forward that leave the rest of us wondering, how did they manage that? This is also what we need for the whole continent on a global scale with the competitiveness of the European economy. I would therefore like to highlight the importance of the new competitiveness deal presented by the Hungarian presidency and accepted by the European Council last week. This landmark initiative emphasizes the need to close the innovation and productivity gap, both with our global competitors and within the EU, while ensuring the EU sovereignty, security, resilience, and global influence. This deal is not just about surviving in a global economy, it's about empowering Europe's business to thrive and to lead. In recent years, the European Union has been actively addressing these crises with comprehensive policies. I tend to agree with many of Mario Draghi's and Enrico Letta's remarks in the sense that Europe needs structural reforms to boost productivity and reduce strategic dependencies. I also welcomed the SME relief package, which aims to provide an SME-friendly business environment. The pandemic and the recent geopolitical disruptions have underscored the importance of strengthening our local manufacturing capabilities to ensure a stable supply chains of essential products. One of the critical goals of the Hungarian presidency is to reduce the EU's strategic dependencies in key sectors by empowering SMEs to scale up and innovate in advanced manufacturing. We can build a more resilient industrial base across Europe. The implementation of AI and other emerging technologies is crucial for increasing productivity. Productivity-enhancing reforms are essential for sustainable growth, and AI stands out as a key driver of such change. We looked forward to the AI Act with positive anticipation. We are also working to make digital tools, including AI, more accessible and affordable for micro and small enterprises. You may have noticed that the Rubik's Cube is the central logo of both the Hungarian presidency and this year's SME Assembly as well. This iconic puzzle is not just a symbol of Hungary's rich legacy of invention, it's also the perfect metaphor for the complexities that drive Europe's small businesses. Much like the Rubik's Cube, the challenges facing SMEs are multidimensional. To succeed, you have to tackle multiple issues: regulation, financing, employment, and digital transformation, all at once. But as anyone who has solved a Rubik's Cube can tell you, each twist and turn brings you closer to alignment, to finding the solution. Each step forward reveals new possibilities. This assembly serves as a platform for collaboration and the exchange of ideas. Over the next few days, you will hear from distinguished speakers and engaged in discussions that will ignite our collective efforts toward a stronger, more competitive SME ecosystem in Europe. I hope many of you had the opportunity to attend the business visits earlier this afternoon. I have heard you enjoyed it. These visits provided a unique insight into the dynamism of Hungary's entrepreneurial scene. I hope you had the chance to meet some truly inspiring women entrepreneurs who have built successful businesses across a variety of sectors. Some of you explored the world of fintech, one of the most exciting sectors for SME in Europe today. And now, the highlight of the evening, after my speech, we are particularly excited about the lecture to be given by the Professor Johan Wiklund. His insights promise to inspire and challenge us. The pressure on the professor, and we will see how it will end it. We have heard a lot of good things about the professor. I encourage you to use this opportunity, not just for tonight, but for the 3 days events, to connect with each other, to inspire and to be inspired, and to bring new ideas back to your communities. Thank you for being here. And now, officially, let's kick off the 2024 SME Assembly. Thank you very much.
But first, I am back. But thank you, State Secretary. We continue today the list of outstanding speakers with Professor Johan Wiklund. Johan Wiklund is Swedish, and he's a renowned entrepreneurship scholar and professor of entrepreneurship at Syracuse University's Martin J. Whitman School of Management. His research there focuses on entrepreneurship, small business management, and organizational behavior. And some of the key aspects of his research are how entrepreneurial orientation influences a firm's performance and growth. He investigated the relationship between innovation and entrepreneurship and examines how entrepreneurs manage risk and uncertainty in their ventures. And the latter is always necessary, perhaps even more so these days. Recently, Professor Wiklund also looked into entrepreneurial resilience. Now, resilience is something that SMEs are delivering day in, day out. And his research is therefore very topical to our work. We're all looking forward to your lecture, Professor Wiklund. But before, let's have a quick look at earlier editions of the Schumpeter Innovation in Enterprise lecture.
Challenge for governments is to, at the same time, give incentives for people to become innovators, to give them grants, but make sure that they don't use these grants to later on prevent new innovators from coming in.
This could be the basis for a European program for sustainable growth, because transition towards sustainability requires substantial investments in sustainable energy, increased energy efficiency, public transport and infrastructure and so on.
If you subsidize a firm to do more R&D, it should choose projects that it wouldn't have done if it hadn't had the subsidy. That means that the return should be lower than the return without the subsidy.
It's not so much the buying up that's the problem, is what then is the system, the ecosystem, what happens to the research and the thinking, the out-of-the-box thinking of those small companies when they're bought up by an ultra-financialized large company.
That was basically Schumpeter's basic perspective, that the success of a market economy is that entrepreneurial spirit, people having an idea, and in the quest for new technologies that address the needs of society, standards of living will increase.
Yes, if you want, you will find an excuse, but try not to, because finding an excuse is like walking your life with your eyes closed, because it's 21st century and the problems are here.
I think that my predecessors, from Philippe Aguillon down to Jan Vaderburg, have all highlighted the importance of research, of innovation in terms of economic growth. What Schumpeter added was this individual entrepreneurship element, which has never really been included into economic theory.
They told me that entrepreneurship research is an oxymoron, right? I wanted to do a PhD in entrepreneurship, and there was no such thing, even in the United States. And so the idea of oxymoron or moron would come up.
Already, and very much looking forward to your lecture, Professor Wiklund. The floor and our attention are all yours.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be back in Budapest. I have some really fond memories from being here. The first time I was here was actually in the spring of 1989, only weeks after Hungary opened its border to Austria, which was the beginning of the fall of the Iron Curtain. So those were very exciting times. So let's see. So today I'm going to talk about things that I think are close to the heart of most people in this audience, namely entrepreneurship policies here in Europe, and whether they lead to innovative ecosystems or to copycat monocultures. I will be somewhat provocative, not because I'm a provocateur. I think I'm a pretty nice guy. But I want to be thought-provoking so you might consider what you're doing, reflect upon that, and potentially start doing things differently as policymakers moving forward. There will be time for Q&A at the end, I've been promised. But I will ask you a couple of questions throughout. So I will share some QR codes on my slides. So you might want to get your phones out so you can answer those questions. These are essentially polls, so I can see what you guys think about a few different questions. So one of the points of departure for my talk is my own history. I was born and raised in Sweden, but for the last 17 years I've lived in the US. Last 10 years, I've actually been an American citizen. That picture is from when I became an American citizen. But I have a lot of contacts here in Europe. I have 2 part-time positions in Europe. I tend to spend my holidays here, so I go here on a regular basis. And the other point of departure is actually this report that was written by Mario Draghi and released 2 months ago. I know it has received a lot of attention. And what I find so interesting about this report is that the title is The Future of European Competitiveness. And when he talks about competitiveness, he immediately jumps to innovation. He's talking about innovation is the key. And Europe must essentially catch up with the US and China, saying that the US and China are ahead of us. We need to be better at innovation so that we can catch up. Importantly, the US and China got to where they are in very different ways. If you think about the US, it's very much a bottom-up model. The role of government is very much to stay out of the way. You have these creative people, entrepreneurs, start businesses. We have a well-working capital market, so we have venture capitalists and rich individuals who invest into these businesses. And they tend to grow pretty quickly, and within even decades, or in some cases within a few years, they can become leaders in their industry. If we think about China, it's very much the other way around. It's very much top-down. The government sets targets. The government decides these are things where we should excel, and then kind of business follows in those footsteps. And the question, of course, is if we are going to be competitive with these two parts of the world, which path are we going to choose here in Europe? Are we going to choose the American? Are we going to choose the Chinese? Or maybe it's best if we choose our own path, because the structure in Europe is quite different from both China and the US. So that's largely where my talk comes from. I will focus on entrepreneurship policies. Innovation involves more than entrepreneurship, I know that, but of course entrepreneurship is a very important part of innovation. It also happens to be the part that I know the most about, and it's about what I have time to talk about over 45 minutes or so. So I would argue that just as China is on a clear path, and as Draghi says, in the US is on a clear path, I actually think that Europe seems to be heading down a specific path. I mean, I'm not sure it's the right one. It's something I think can be debated. It's something I want to talk a bit about, reflect on whether it is the right one or not. So I will identify 3 problems of the current path that Europe is choosing when it comes to entrepreneurship policies, and then I will end by offering some solutions that hopefully you find compelling. So I want to call the path that Europe is on in terms of entrepreneurship policy, I actually want to call this Silicon Valley model. And what I mean by this Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship policy looks something like this. So you have a university with excellent research, and connected to this university you have students and researchers that are very entrepreneurial. They're eager to start their own businesses. They want to become gazillionaires as people before them. And then you create infrastructure where they can take their ideas and develop those ideas into full-fledged businesses, such as incubators and accelerators. And then you make sure that you find mentors, either leaders of industry or other entrepreneurs that have done it themselves. You connect them with those. You also connect them with the people who have the resources, venture capitalists and business angels. And then you create spaces where these people can meet and build relationships, become friendly with each other, and start working together. And voila, there you have a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I think this is very much the model that we currently work according to in Europe in terms of entrepreneurship policy. I think it's kind of curious to think, why is that the case? Why is this the model that is so predominant? I mean, after all, it's not a model that was developed here. It's something that comes from the US that we have kind of imported into Europe from the US. I think there's an obvious answer to that question, and that is this is an extremely successful model. I mean, I only need to show you this picture of Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Back in 1998, they started Google, this new search engine, and within a few months, they had venture capital investments from a couple of successful entrepreneurs. And what is it, 25, 26 years later, it's one of the highest valued companies in the world, leader of industry, definitely changing the world. So, I mean, it's a phenomenal successful model. And of course, there's a lot of companies other than Google that come out of this model. But I think there's another explanation that is just as important, and this is that the US is phenomenal at cultural influence. If you think about it, I mean, you can think about rock music, you can think about rap music, you can think about Coca-Cola, McDonald's, hamburgers, whatever you want. These are things that are now ubiquitous all over the world, and they all come out from the US. And I think the same applies to entrepreneurship policies. The US is just very good at influencing the rest of the world. And I believe that this myth about Silicon Valley is very strong here in Europe. I would assume that there's a lot of policymakers in Europe that have paid more visits to Silicon Valley than they have paid to entrepreneurial ecosystems in the neighboring countries. You think that's true? So I'm going to ask you a question here so you can get your phones out. So here are examples of the 10 largest tech companies out of Silicon Valley on your left-hand side, and the 10 largest tech companies coming out of Europe. So I'm simply asking, which of these companies are you more familiar with? And just be honest. You can read the names there. And there I think you should have a QR code you can scan and answer the question. I think we can stop it. There were over 100 people voting, but I think you get the message, right? Even here in Europe, even you guys that are involved in entrepreneurship policy or entrepreneurs yourself, even you guys know more about those companies than the biggest tech companies that we have coming out of Europe. And I don't think so. It's only because they're successful. I think there's much more to the picture than that. I think it's the same thing if we look at the 10 most wealthy entrepreneurs in the world. 7 of them happen to be from the US. 1 happens to be from China. He's pretty well known as well. 1 is from Mexico, and 1 is from France. And I would assume that most people are more familiar with the 7 from America than the 1 from France or the 1 from Mexico. So when it comes to entrepreneurial companies, when it comes to entrepreneurs, I think it's very much the US that dominates the conversation. But the same goes with the language. I'm assuming that most people have heard, if not all, at least most of these terms: minimal viable product, or MVP, lean startup, growth hacking, fail fast, fail often, disrupt the industry, pivoting, scaling, unicorns. And I find it very interesting when I speak to my friends in Sweden, whether they are policymakers or they're entrepreneurs, they use these terms all the time, and they even use them in English. Unicorn is a word that's been around the Swedish language for 300 years at least, but still they use the American term. I've heard, I don't speak a lot of languages, I've heard it's the same in Japan, I've heard it's the same in Latin America, that when we talk about these things, we actually use the American terms and not translations into our own languages. And of course, as you know, the language we use influences the ways we think. So I would argue that this kind of model of Silicon Valley, it dominates how we talk, it dominates how we think, and it also dominates how we act in relation to entrepreneurship. So I would say that to a large extent, I think European entrepreneurship policy tries to copy Silicon Valley. Now, when I say this to people, say, no, Johan, you're wrong. We're not at all trying to copy Silicon Valley. We're doing other things. And I think to some extent that is true, but then when I hear when they continue talking, I hear they actually do use those words that are shown on the previous slide. They have the same kind of, try to build similar kinds of ecosystems with incubators and accelerators and stuff. So even if they may be focused on other areas of technology, I think a lot of the language used, a lot of the programming that goes on is very much influenced by Silicon Valley. The question is this a good or a bad idea? I mean, it is highly successful, right? And copying success isn't necessarily a bad thing, is it? I do it all the time. I think we all do. You see somebody doing something really successful in sports or whatever, you try to do whatever they're doing, right? So I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. But we got to realize, first of all, we got to realize that the Silicon Valley model comes with certain downsides. So this is a pretty recent paper written by 2 American scholars. And what they did was that they looked across the US, this is all American data, but they looked at areas where the tech sector had boomed and a lot of venture capital had moved in. As you know, there are places such as Austin and so forth, which have very vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems. And one interesting finding here is that they found that when that happens, when tech moves in, when venture capital moves in, they see more economic inequality. And if you go to Silicon Valley, you notice the same thing. There is a lot of inequality, just as there is a lot of inequality all over America. And I think that Americans are much more tolerant to economic inequality than we are here in Europe. And the argument they make here is that you can't have one without the other. It's very hard to have this vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem, the tech, the venture capital, without also having the economic inequality. And here's another paper written by a good friend, David Aldrich, where he says, have we oversold the Silicon Valley model? And he talks about the fact that there are other models of successful entrepreneurship, but they just don't get the same kind of attention, like I said, because America has this wonderful way of spreading its culture all over the world. And he's arguing for that we need a more diverse and inclusive approach to entrepreneurship policy. And this is something I agree with and something I will get back to towards the end of my talk. So there are certainly downsides with this model as well. So I'm going to talk about 3 problems with the current model and then also offer some possible solutions to those problems. So the first question is, are these ecosystems that we build and use in these policies here in Europe, are they really robust? And so I've visited many entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. I've been to Sydney, Singapore, San Francisco, Seville, Stockholm, so start with the letter S. So what do you think is the most striking observations I made when I visited those ecosystems? And you're going to get 4 different options. So the first option is they all look different, they all look the same, there are so many or there are so few. Those are the 4 options you have. And hopefully you can vote for them. Oh, can we see how people vote? Hopefully on the next one. I'm going to wait until at least 100 people have voted. Let's see. Interesting. All right. Excited to see the answer? Exactly. Well, you're good. That was exactly what struck me. They all look the same. That's exactly the observation I made. So here are actually some pictures. I hope you can see them. These are actually downloaded from the website. I Googled things such as entrepreneurial ecosystems, business incubators and stuff. So these pictures come from all over the world. And if you just look at, you see how similar they look in terms of like the architecture, in terms of the kind of furniture they have, and also the kinds of people that actually populate these spaces. I mean, they're from all over the place. One is from Northumbria, and I don't know. Yeah, they're from all sorts of parts of the world. But that's what strikes me the most. It's the same. And I call this the McDonaldization of entrepreneurial ecosystems. I mean, if you go to McDonald's, you know, anywhere you go in the world, whether you're here in Budapest or you're in Syracuse or where you might be, the whole idea of McDonald's is that it should look exactly the same. When you order your Big Mac, it should look the same, it should smell the same, it should taste the same. You should have no idea where you are in the world. That's kind of the whole idea of McDonald's. And that's the way I feel about these ecosystems as well. That if I walk into one in Singapore and I'm blindfolded and I take the blindfold off, I can't say if I'm in Stockholm or if I'm in Singapore, if I'm in San Francisco, or maybe even if I'm in Budapest. So if we look at natural ecosystems, what makes them robust, we can see, you know, typically you can see that there are many different species in these natural ecosystems. You can see they look pretty messy, actually. They're certainly not planned, but they develop organically through natural selection. On the other hand, if you look at a monoculture, you can see It's just one species, obviously, and you can also see they're neatly planted there by human beings in straight lines. So that is kind of the contrast I like to make. And if we look at natural ecosystems and what makes them robust, the first thing is that they're adapted to local conditions in terms of the climate. They're adapted to local external factors such as climate and soil. There's a lot of internal variation, meaning that there are many different species. They evolve randomly. There's no plan. There's redundancy, which means that if one species happens to disappear, that's okay. It doesn't mean that the ecosystem collapses. And they can withstand disturbances. For example, if there's an invasive species that comes, or if there's like a wildfire or whatever, they can withstand those kind of disturbances. They're unique because they're locally adapted. If you go from one to the other, they're not going to look the same. They're essentially the opposite of a monoculture. And I think when we look at entrepreneurial ecosystems, I think that we largely see the opposite of these robust ecosystems. They're more like monocultures, where they're not adapted to this local conditions. They all look the same. They all tend to attract the same kinds of ideas and people. There's very little internal variation as well. There's not like many different species. It's very much the same kind of people doing the same kinds of things. They're not unique, but they're like all other ecosystems you can find around the world. And I find it interesting because we actually talk about entrepreneurship here, and uniqueness and novelty are kind of the premise of entrepreneurship, right? That's what entrepreneurship is all about, isn't it? Being unique, being novel. And that's not what we see when we look at the entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I'm not sure they're all that robust if the environment changes. And one thing I've just thought about recently is this thing about readiness for military technology. I know that in many countries, policymakers are scrambling to have more companies getting started, more entrepreneurs engaging in military technology. And I also understand that that's a hard challenge because people are focused on other things. We don't have that variety, so it's easy for people to just switch and go into this. I happen to mention a program there that's an exception, which is about the space industry where there's a lot of entrepreneurship going on. But anyway, I think that's just an example where I see that we don't have that robustness if there are external shocks happening. I'm not the first one to talk about this. There's a person called Dane Stangler. I'm sure some of you have met him because 10, 12 years ago he traveled around the world and evaluated entrepreneurial ecosystems. He ran a company. And one of the things he noticed was that what I'm talking about, they all look the same. And he's saying all economic development can't be about promoting tech startups. He encourages local policymakers to be leery of copycat solutions. I don't think it's become any better in the past 10 years. I think I still see the same kind of patterns that he saw 10 years ago. Okay, so I'm going to give the example of AI. I'm a big fan of AI myself. I use it all the time. I encourage my students to use it. I think it's very, very helpful for a scholar and for students. And if we take this kind of development of an industry, the S-curve, we can see in the beginning we have the early entrants. You know, people are a bit hesitant, so at the beginning it goes slowly, and then you get this large growth spurt when more and more people get into the industry, more and more customers are interested, and eventually plateaus when we have saturation. And then we have to have some new innovation to continue growing the industry. I think that S-curve is well known to most people. And the question is, where on that S-curve are we right now? And that's hard to know. We know that the adoption of AI has been just absolutely enormous. It's a green curve on that graph. We can see, for example, OpenAI, they launched ChatGPT 2 years ago plus 4 days. And they have over 1 billion users. It's one of the 10 most popular websites, and it's one of the most popular software in the world. And that's 2 years after its launch. And as recently as a month ago, they raised $6.6 billion in venture capital, which is actually the biggest round of venture capital investment ever in the history of the world. So that's quite a lot of money. So, but what I think is interesting thing is, oh well, here's another thing. Already in February, Failery did a ranking of incubators and accelerators focusing on AI, and they identified the top 182. They didn't identify 182, they identified the top 182. And I'm sure that a lot of incubators, accelerators have appeared since. So my question is just, so what are the prospects for AI entrepreneurship policies launched today? Let's say I live somewhere in the world, let's say I live in Stockholm, Sweden, and I say that, oh, we're going to start going into AI, we want to have more startups in this area. Well, the question is, it might already be too late, because so much has already happened. There are already so many in this space. And again, entrepreneurship is about doing different things and doing novel things. So the question is it better to start thinking about doing something different? That's a problem when everybody's doing the same thing, that the market soon gets saturated. We can also see that this model that I spoke about, how it starts with this research university and entrepreneurial students and faculty members, but how that kind of is the origin of the model. But we can see it trickling down to other parts of other kinds of regions, I should say. I'm just going to give you this one example from Sweden. It's called the Helsingborg Innovation District, where business, academia, and the public sector collaborate to find innovative solutions for sustainable growth. And what I find interesting about this area is there is no research university there. There is no venture capital there. There's actually very little of those kind of fundamental elements of this model. But interestingly enough, they're running the same kind of programs. They're running this, the lean startup model. They're doing their business model canvases. They're doing their pitching competitions, even if they're public health workers, and there's no venture capital to be seen. And I find it interesting. I know it's not only in Sweden. I know that this happens around Europe in many other places as well, that we kind of use the same models, even if the structures, fundamental infrastructure isn't in place. Am I being a little bit provocative? A little bit critical? So I question if this model, the Silicon Valley model, is robust in Europe. There's no doubt it's very robust in Silicon Valley. I'm sure it's robust in some locations in Europe, but I'm not sure it's a good thing to kind of have that as a foundation for entrepreneurship policy more generally when we want to build robust entrepreneurial ecosystems. Okay, question number 2 is, are we targeting the right people and ideas in these entrepreneurial ecosystems? So I would argue, if we look at the target audience that we try to attract to these entrepreneurial ecosystems, it's largely STEM graduates, people who study science, technology, engineering, and medicine. And they're very often young. I mean, there's a lot of efforts at many universities to even have students in these areas come and start their own businesses, or people who have recently graduated. They very often tend to be male. They very often tend to be white or Asian. And they tend to like drinking coffee and craft beer. Every one of those places I go to, there's always one of those fancy espresso machines sitting there on a counter that people use. And we might think about them as tech bros. That's a term that's been used. So my stereotype of one of those people would be something like this. It's not my son. He looks quite a lot like my son, and it's nothing wrong with my son, nothing wrong with this guy. But that's kind of the stereotype I have when we think about these are the people we want to populate our entrepreneurial ecosystems. And the question is that effective? I think one important thing is that this is probably the most attractive group in the labor market, meaning that it's very easy for these guys to find a job, right? If you have that kind of education, that kind of background, you can easily find a job. And we're kind of trying to convince them, well, rather than go and apply for that job, why don't you start your own business? And we have these nice facilities for you if you do, and that's all paid for by your parents or other people, taxpayers, in other words. And the question then is, what's the opportunity cost for the individual? Is it really a good idea for that person who might have an idea for a business, but also might be able to land a job at a big company and have a good career there? Is it really a good idea for them to choose to become entrepreneurs? And also, what's the opportunity cost for society? For example, could these people potentially go work for a company such as Google or another tech company and be more productive there than they would be if they ran their own business? And fortunately for this latter question, there's actually been quite a bit of research showing that, yes, indeed, they are more productive when they go work for a big company than they are when they start their own businesses. And I also think, because we're talking about tax money here, I think it's always important to think about more vulnerable groups. So here are these people, great opportunities to start to get a job. We invest money so they start their own businesses. At the same time, we have a lot of people in most countries that have a very hard time getting a job. And the question is, would it be an alternative if we try to help them, invest resources in them, to try and start their own businesses instead? And there's also a question if these people are better off starting these STEM graduates might be better off starting businesses without this support. And I've actually been involved in some research on this myself. We looked at all incubated firms in America compared to a matched sample of not incubated firms over a period of about 15 years. And what we found was that initially the incubated firms did better. They had a higher survival rate, largely because they were sheltered from the market. They were in it, like the incubator worked as an incubator should. But after 5 years, it changed, so the non-incubated firms actually did better. And we're arguing that being exposed to the market from day one is a good thing for a business because you learn how the market works, you adapt to the market. If you're an incubator, you don't learn that from day one, and it's hard to retrain after you move out from there. So in this case, incubation was not a good idea. We also see that there are similar processes that you're exposed to in these ecosystems. There are similar selection criteria, similar teams and ideas are supported. So I like this one. It says that for fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And that's pretty easy to do for a bird or for a monkey, not so easy for the fish or the elephant. And my point is that even if very diverse group of people were interested in getting into this ecosystem because of the selection criteria, they won't be accepted because we were very much focused on a certain kind of entrepreneurs and ideas. Similar programming, the lean startup, the business model canvas, pitching your idea once you have an idea to potential investors. Similar networking opportunities with advisors, mentors, venture capitalists, public servants, and big companies you might work with. So very similar processes in this regard. So this is a question. So if we have like a homogeneous people are pretty much similar. They go through a similar process. What comes out at the other end? We kind of expect all these brand new phenomenal ideas that's going to be groundbreaking to come out at the other end. And I think that's not necessarily the case. It doesn't make sense. I think if you had more diverse programs, more diverse population, the chance would be higher that you get unique output. I think it's more that everything looks and sounds the same. So here is a paper that I also wrote where we looked at all STEM graduates in Sweden, and we looked at those started businesses, and we looked at those that worked for business versus those that worked for universities or research, universities. And we found that those that worked for business and then started their own business, they did better in terms of performance than those that worked at the universities. And again, it's because we think if you work for business, you acquire this commercial knowledge. You know how to learn how to do business, so to say. Whereas the research knowledge you acquire at the university is not as valuable when you start your business. Okay, third problem, who gets access to these ecosystems and who does not? So here's my third question. So it's hard to find good data, but in this case, it's essentially what percentage of venture-backed founders are female. So this is data that comes mainly out of the US. It's Crunchbase. They did a study that published in 2021. So the question is, what percentage of venture-backed founders are female? So you have four options. Is it 10%, 20%, 30%, or is it 40%? It's about, this study showed that it was about 10.9%, so 11 essentially. Well done. I think part of the reason I love showing this picture, because it's like, I said every one of those, if I go to an incubator, I always find a football table, or else I'll find a ping pong table. And they don't necessarily appeal that much to women. And this guy I spoke to was the manager of an incubator. He said, yeah, we actually put the ping pong table down in the basement. We only use the football table these days. But I'm sure you've seen this environment. On a more serious note, there's research done here about if incubators, particularly incubators, are inclusive of women entrepreneurs. And what they report is that we find low levels of gender-inclusive practicing among the most impactful business incubators. Here's another really interesting paper. As I said, there's in a lot of this programming, pitching your idea to potential investors is a very important step. And here they compared men and women pitching their ideas to investors. And what they find is that women use more concrete language, men use more abstract language. And this is not unique to this setting. This is just men and women typically differ in that respect. But what's interesting is that they found that the abstract language used by men, the investor associated that more with long-term growth and scaling. And therefore, they were more prone to invest into the businesses pitched by men. And that even applied if they controlled for that they actually pitched the same kind of businesses. So they kind of controlled for that there was some systematic differences between the businesses. So I think that's an interesting finding. Here's I heard that Tom Cooney was going to be here. Are you here, Tom? Well, he's going to come here tomorrow. I was advertising his research. So there's also research pointing to the fact that these ecosystems are not that attractive to underrepresented minorities. Okay, so who feels welcomed and who does, and why? So architecture, design, and features are not gender neutral. That's really important to remember. I have never met anybody who has thought about gender when they design these kinds of spaces related to entrepreneurial ecosystems. I'm sure there are examples, but I just never heard of an example. I think we could do much better there. We know that many with other ethnic, education, economic backgrounds don't feel welcome. We know that the language and the tools, the programs were not developed with diversity in mind. Take pitching as an example. So for example, we've been doing interviews of entrepreneurs going through the Lean Startup training framework, and instructors are instructed to use what's called radical candor. And we do know from our interviews this is something that in particular women do not like at all. And I mean, I guess all EU countries have undersigned these sustainable development goals from the UN. And I think we might want to consider those in terms of our entrepreneurship policies. And the same goes for diversity and inclusion aspirations that the EU have been quite vocal about, that it might be time to include them also in entrepreneurship policies. So that was all the bad news. Those are the three problems identified. Let's see, what can we do? What can we do? Some ideas. I think it's really important to understand one thing. Silicon Valley was built and grew organically, so structures appeared to support what developed. So for example, Arthur Rock moved there and started venture capital because the companies in Silicon Valley weren't able to get bank loans. So the startups came first, and then they needed a service, and then that service developed. And probably most interesting is this fact that William Shockley, the inventor of the transistor, kind of the founder of Silicon Valley, he worked at Bell Labs over in New Jersey when he invented the transistor and got the Nobel Prize. He moved to Palo Alto because his mother was sick. She lived there, that's why he moved there. He wanted his fellow people from Bell Labs to move in there with him, but they disliked him so much. He was such a bad manager that they didn't want to move and work with him. That's why he had to hire people from Stanford. So I think it's interesting to keep in mind that this model did not develop because they did their research at Stanford. It developed because somebody was a genius and came up with a technology that had a sick mother. And it all grew organically from that. What we try to do is very often we try to impose established structures from above. We have this idea, this is what an ecosystem, effective entrepreneurial ecosystem looks like. This is what we're going to build in this region. I think it's much better if we try instead to do what they actually did in Silicon Valley, build things bottom up based on what already exists. And I think we should utilize the diversity we have in European cities. These days, I would say most European cities are actually very diverse along any kind of dimension, whether you're talking about ethnicity or educational background or whatever. I know there are attempts, I'm aware, for example, there are incubators and stuff for refugees in many large European cities, but I think very often these kinds of infrastructure and ecosystems are created for people that represent diversity rather than by those people representing diversity. And I also wonder if these places have the same kind of standing and the same resources available to them as the more standard ones. We should also remember that change is going to be difficult because there's a whole industry. I'm assuming some of the industry is represented here, but there's a whole industry of consultants and policymakers and others that benefit from and reproduces this existing ecosystem. So I'm assuming when we turn to Q&A, I'm going to get quite a lot of pushback from people that disagree with what I'm talking about here. But that's okay. So I think there's a lot of people who benefit from preserving the status quo. So that's going to make change difficult. But some suggestions. By its nature, innovation is surprising, it's chaotic, it's serendipitous, and it's uncontrollable. And it works best when different kinds of people get together and they get access to slack resources, essentially meaning they have enough resources that they can do something together. So I think what we need is more experimentation. Think more about that natural ecosystem image I showed you before. We need more of that and less of those straight, nice rows of monocultures. So we need more experimentation and less management. We need to try many different models, I think, and we must accept that many of these models, if not most, will fail. And we need to create meeting places that attract more different kinds of people. I think it's important to realize that architecture and design matter. I think we should particularly think about gender and inclusivity when it comes to those kinds of things. And like I said, build bottom up. And then we should use language, we should use tools and methods that's anchored in the local culture. Just because they start talking about pivoting in Silicon Valley 5 years ago, we don't all need to be talking about here in Europe. I think the situation is quite different. Okay, summing up. I think entrepreneurship ecosystems are way too similar along multiple dimensions. And I think it's ideas from the outside, in particular, that Silicon Valley are being imposed on these ecosystems. Is that effective? Are they robust? I mean, we have quite little research, quite little knowledge. My belief is that they're not as effective, not as robust as they could and should be. We tend to focus on people with many job opportunities, but we tend to exclude more vulnerable groups from these ecosystems. We must realize that innovation stems from chaos and diversity. It's not a planned process. We should build our ecosystems bottom up, use locally adapted language, tools, and systems. We need to evaluate what we do till we figure out what actually works and what doesn't work. And bottom line, I think that entrepreneurship policy needs to be more entrepreneurial. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much. That was indeed provocative. And this is what we wanted, you to be provocative.
Yeah.
So certainly, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for this presentation. My Deputy Director General said before that entrepreneurship is very much at the heart of the work that we do in the Commission. And before giving the floor to the audience to give you to pose you provocative questions, I wanted to use the opportunity to give you this Being Entrepreneurship guide that we have done in the Commission, and that I think very much follows the approach that you are suggesting. I will be curious to hear your views.
Absolutely.
I think we are promoting diversity, and you will see there that we are certainly promoting female entrepreneurship.
Are you using the language of the Silicon Valley, or are you using the local
you will
language?
See.
Are you using the tools of the Silicon Valley or locally developed tools?
We have all different type of guys there in the picture.
I'll read and enjoy, I promise.
So certainly, I'll be curious to have your views there. We have 30 copies of the guide. There is a QR inside. The idea is also to provide with ideas, concrete ideas, to the people that go online and adapt to their context, to their specific situation. So we have 30 copies. Certainly, we can give some of these copies to those of you asking the most provocative questions. So I certainly invite you to put forward the questions. Without any further delay, and I have one person over there raising the hand. Voila, this is much better for me. Now, the lady there, and then on the right hand, on the left side, the lady first there. Yes. Perhaps we have 4 micro here.
I think there should be people with microphones that could give them to you. So down here.
Can we go down here in the middle? Yeah. The lady standing up. 1, 2 per person, and then I have 3 there.
Yeah.
Therefore,
the lights are pretty bright.
Yes, that's. Okay, we have 1 micro there, and then if the next micro can go to the upper part.
It's already
to the upper part. Yeah. Go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Lučka. I'm from the European Banking Federation. Okay. I work on SMEs access to finance, entrepreneurship funding, financial markets, and also sustainable finance in my team. 2 questions about the US and also Europe. In your remarks about the US, you referred to the US model as robust as far as the US is concerned. I was thinking of all the criticism last year, you will of course have followed that more closely, about the way the US entrepreneurship is financed, because there were a lot of articles last year about how there had been actually a herd mentality in terms of how the VC was funneling the same money always into the same kind of things with actually no originality. And also the fact that the business was actually, the business that we admire from outside, was very much concentrated. I mean, the financing of entrepreneurship in the US was very much concentrated, and sometimes in one bank, really, more than, I think, 50% of all the startups had been in the SVB, I think. That was one of the things that was remarked. So my first question is, how do you see the model working out in the US in terms of how robust it is? I know this is not the focus of your lecture today, but you'll have a view. And my second, excuse me, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. My second question is quicker. Are you hoping that there will be, with these suggestions, more of a social entrepreneurship as an outcome? Thank you.
Great questions. I mean, I personally believe that the fundamental model in the US where you have this kind of bottom-up, that you find innovation, people come up with solutions that they quite often solve problems for themselves. Take Uber as an example. It's virtually impossible to find a cab, so there you start a business, and that happens to spread all over the world. So I think in that sense, that model there, I think, is robust, because the US tends to be very fast in terms of coming up with new technology. I mean, you can think about electric cars as another example, where I think Tesla is a phenomenal example of the US at its best. I think nobody would have predicted that a startup would come to dominate that industry, you know, because you need the whole national infrastructure of chargers and all things. Then, of course, the herd mentality. It's been criticized, not least in terms of AI, that there's way too much money invested into AI, and it's a complete waste of money. I mean, time will tell. I mean, I don't know. The thing about concentration, you were talking about, I think you're talking about geographic concentration, right? Yeah, sector, okay. But you also have the geographic concentration, and I think there's a big difference, because in the US, people tend to there's a lot more movement. So where I live in Syracuse, for example, that's a pretty depressed area. There's not a lot of things going on, and you can say, they're trying to get more entrepreneurship happening there, but what's also happening is that people are relocated to those places where you can see more development, typically further to the south. When it comes to robustness, I think I'm going to give one more example. It's easy to look back than look forward. Look at oil production. The US is now by far the biggest oil producer in the world. That was all thanks to the fact that they realized that it is a challenge for us not to be having our own supply of oil. And of course, they came up with all these innovations that have been able to extract a lot more oil. I think that Europe gets about 30% of its oil from the US these days, for example, if I'm not mistaken. So I think the US is robust, yes, I do. And then you had the question if I'm looking towards more social entrepreneurship. Not necessarily. I would love it to see it, but I'm more thinking about the way innovation works. It's like, you can't really, it's really, really difficult to manage. And we need much more different people trying to engage in entrepreneurship. I think it's very interesting. In Europe, we have at the same time, we have a lack of entrepreneurship over here. And on the other hand, we have a lack of inclusivity in the labor market over there. Then to me, it seems like there should be opportunities for marrying them to some extent. And I'm not sure if that necessarily is the social entrepreneurship, but it's certainly more inclusive entrepreneurship in terms of the kinds of people who get engaged, and also in terms of the kinds of ideas that we support. I'm not sure that's a good answer, but that's the best I can do.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Perfect.
Lovely. Good evening. Thank you, Professor. My name is Ciprian Stănescu. I'm coming from Romania. And I'm going to start with a confession. Like last year in Bilbao, we won one of the awards for one of our incubators. And the confession is that we stopped doing that incubator, or any other incubator, starting with this year, mainly for the reasons that you pointed out. Oh. And I'm very happy, not to contradict you, but to find almost like an ally in the room. Yeah. Because everyone says, oh, you stopped doing incubators, what will you do now? Yeah. But I also have another confession, which is the obvious part, is that I'm a man, so I will ask an abstract question, which is, if in Europe we have been trying to create entrepreneurs through these factories, or McDonaldization, let's call it, right? as a policy maker, there's a lot of them in the room, what sort of factories should we build in the future? If the type of factories that we have built are not that functional, is there a type of factory that we can build? And whether these factories can have within themselves less skills to innovate and perhaps more skills to adapt? Thank you.
Yeah, that's. I'm going to throw a question back to you, and that is, what are you doing instead of the incubators? I'm just curious.
Sustainability education.
Okay. I mean, we had. I mean, education is always going to be good. It's always going to be valuable. I think in building I think that building the infrastructure in terms of, you know, it's safe to be a citizen. There's running water and roads. There's education. There's all those kinds of things. I mean, that is what, to me, public policy is. That's 101 public policy. Making sure you have those things that are working, and you know, and then I think that trying to create spaces where people are creative can come together. It's what we can do, and then we just have to hope that it works. I mean, it's like out of all the things I've seen, I'm old enough. I've seen all these new technologies growing up. Everything I've seen, I've been the biggest skeptic at the beginning. I never forget the first time I saw email. I thought it was the stupidest thing ever. I was at MIT in 1987. Who in the world is going to use that stuff? I mean, nobody. So I think it's so hard. I mean, after the fact, it's so easy to see that, you know, even AI, I think 5 years ago, did anybody think that AI was going to be a big thing in this room? Maybe one or two, right? I think it's just so hard to make these predictions that so I think we need to have just the infrastructure in place, the education, all those things, and then just, you know, hope that people come up with good ideas and then have opportunities to develop them further. Of course, like Draghi writes about he writes, I mean, I'm not going to argue with him in any way. He talks about the capital markets and those kinds of things. They need to be more liquid and more better integrated and so forth. I completely agree with that we need to be able, when we have promises, ideas, we need to have the capacity to develop them, like take Google as an example, or OpenAI, that they get that money to develop them into scaling them up to a larger extent. But I believe more indeed that this is a random process. We can't predict it.
I have a question up there from the gentleman. Please try to be concrete, because we still have 5 minutes.
Professor. Thank you very much for your intervention, your speech. Thank you very much. You know maybe that in Europe we have more than 18 million small, medium enterprises.
Yes.
Yes. These enterprises, the main majority, belongs to the old world, means traditional families, businesses, small, medium enterprises around Europe. My question is, do you think that this kind of enterprise, I'm talking for a bakery in Krakow or in a grocery store in Sweden, a family with old stories, without knowledge, sometimes without loans from the banks, sometimes without any logistical system, can adopt artificial intelligence, new technologies? And how? Because they don't have the experience, they don't have the culture for new technologies, and sometimes they don't know how to do it. This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, in my world, and I think very much in the US, we separate small business and small business managers from entrepreneurship. In my world, entrepreneurship is about starting businesses. It's not about working in existing small businesses. I mean, I myself come from a family business background, 3 generations of a family business, 25 employees, so I have some insights into that. I don't regard that as entrepreneurship. I regard that as small business management. And as you say, small businesses are extremely important for the economy of any country, including most European countries. It's way beyond anything I do research about, anything I know. What should small businesses do in order to stay competitive and you know, embrace new technology. So I'm only in kind of this starting business space. Sorry about that.
I have a question over there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Juan Revuelta. I represent a foundation, a small foundation, Finova. We are in Brussels, but also in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. And we are specialized in all green technologies, water, sustainable fashion, etc. My question is about how to afford the risk or the opportunities of working with China or with United States, because of course they are more than open to invest in our startups, or even they are doing Chinese very aggressive in Extremadura region in Spain, investing in projects about electrical cars, batteries, etc. They are looking for startups to try to do joint ventures. We are pro-European. Okay, how to afford? We have been contacted in that field. And with United States, we are starting this year for the soft landing of American companies that wants to come.
So what is the question?
How to afford that? How to afford the relation with, in your opinion, with Chinese? Because it sounds really big.
That's clear.
It sounds to me that you're talking about that you have these nice, in Extremadura, you have these nice tech companies and you get investments coming from the outside, from the US and from China. I would think that would be a good thing in my world, that you have that the capital markets are globalizing, that you have companies in your own region that are attractive enough that people come from those parts of the world and want to invest in them. I guess the challenge probably will be for you in the later stage, which is if these companies are going to stay and develop there. We can take the Swedish company Spotify as an example, which got stock listed in New York City rather than in Stockholm. And now they have more other operations in the US than what they have in Sweden. I would worry more about that than, the fact. I think it's a good thing if money comes in from other parts of the world, but then, can you keep these businesses and have the growth happen locally, or will they eventually move elsewhere? I think that's probably more the challenge. Is that a fair assessment? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I have a question there, and I have a gentleman over there on the upper floor. I don't know if there is any way to.
And then I think we're done.
And we are running out of time, so I'll have one very quick question and a very quick answer. And I'm really sorry about the question over there. Very quick question, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for shaking the foundations. I'm the co-founder of Green Incubator, a Ukrainian clean tech accelerator in Ukraine. And the really quick question would be about the origins of Silicon Valley. Yeah. What do you think, from your perspective, which factor would be larger in weight? The location of home of the founder of semiconductor industry, or reach funding for California and research universities from American Department of Defense? And I would break the rules and add another question. You were describing, seems to me, more public funded infrastructure of ecosystems. Maybe it's time to privatize them and move them more like Brad Feld was saying in his book, that, okay, there are private and public ecosystems, and there are different factors of efficiency. Thank you.
Excellent. The last question first. I mean, I think if you look at Israel, if you look at the US, they've been very successful building all these things largely with private money. I was talking about the Europe. My sense is that Europe is doing this very much in a model where business and public sector working together, and a lot of the investment comes using tax money. I mean, I'm sure that those Y Combinator and whatever they called over in Israel, they will be happy to to come and potentially develop things here as well. I'm not sure to what extent that's already happening, but I was kind of assuming that Europe is going to continue with the model we used so far. But it's obvious that these other models do work in other parts of the world where we don't have the involvement of the public sector. And your first question there, I mean, my point was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's essentially saying that what we have seen happening there over in Silicon Valley, which has had this huge influence on entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship policy and the way we think about entrepreneurship, I think that happened in a way that a lot of people don't know, and they forget about that. Whatever happened there happened because those were the local conditions. That's what worked there. And it's very unlikely that you're going to have exactly the same combination of factors somewhere else. So exactly the same things are going to work somewhere else. We need to think about what do we have here? What is it that makes us unique? Because entrepreneurship is about uniqueness, right? What do we have here that's unique that we can build on? So that was essentially the point I wanted to make there. I'm not going to try to rank which other factors were the more important. Maybe we need a Nobel Prize laureate somewhere that has a sick mother. Maybe that's where we're going to see the growth happening in Europe, who knows?
Thank you very much. I think we can certainly give a big applause to Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.